Amoebas and ape men, DNA and dinosaurs, fossils and the flood. What do all these have in common? Stay tuned as we examine the twin topics of evolution and creation up ahead on today's Bible Questions podcast.
Welcome to the Bible Questions podcast, brought to you by BibleQuestions.org and the Holly Street Church of Christ. This podcast is dedicated to answering your Bible questions from the Bible. My name is Brian, and along with Jeff, we are the hosts of this program.
Hi, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Jeff, and with me today is my co-host, Brian. How are you doing today, Brian?
Hey, Jeff, doing very well, thanks.
A few years ago, I pulled together some material for our teenager class at our congregation on the subject of quote-unquote Christian evidences, which basically is evidence for the validity of the Christianity. And in that particular study, we kind of covered three things. One is evidence for a supreme being who created all things. The evidence for the inspiration of the Bible, which reveals the true nature of that supreme being, and the evidence for Jesus of Nazareth being the Son of God. Sometimes that's also called Christian apologetics. Not an apology like we sometimes use the word today, but reasoned arguments or writings in justification of things, in this case, the Christian faith. So today, Brian and I would like to talk with our listeners to briefly share some of this class material, focusing on the first of those topics, that being the evidence for the existence of a supreme being, creator of the heavens and the earth. And that if our listeners happen to be interested in this topic and would like to dig even deeper into the details, we would certainly encourage them to visit our website at BibleQuestions.org and look under the lessons menu item for a subtopic called Christian living, and then underneath that, the subject of Christian evidences. So, Brian, I think for starting off, I think we need to lay a little bit of groundwork, because there are several different, if you will, world views about the subject of the supreme being. I mean, certainly there is the topic, or the position, I guess I should say, of atheism, that says, there is no God, there is no supreme being. People may also hear of agnostics, those that would say, we can't tell, it's somewhat uncertain, may or may not be. And then, of course, there's theism, which says, yes, there is some kind of God or supreme being. And of course, those kind of worldviews lead to certain, I'll call them value systems, because, if there is no God, then, pretty much everything we see is all there is. Sometimes that's called naturalism, that there's only natural laws, natural forces, at work in the world, that everything we see, cause and effect, is all natural. There is no supernatural, so to speak. That's one kind of value system. Another kind of value system is what we might loosely call Judeo-Christian ethics, based on, in general, the teachings of the Bible, the existence of a creator. In fact, a lot of our American laws are sort of based on that to some degree, reflecting the influence of the Old and New Testament. In fact, and Brian, it's interesting, even within our Declaration of Independence, after mentioning the laws of nature and of nature's God, which is a quote, it starts off with a very familiar quotation, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So we see even the framers of our Constitution, the framers of the Declaration of Independence, late 1700s, they acknowledged, the existence of God, and sort of baked it into the foundation, if you will, of the United States. The other factor, again, given these two different worldviews and these two different value systems, it really often comes down to how it influences us. Our view of the supernatural, our view of the existence of something, someone out there, and our behavior. Is there a quote unquote higher power that sets the standard of what's right and wrong, and it's going to hold us accountable? Because if there's nothing out there, we're on our own. If there is someone out there who is indeed the creator, well, if we're his creation, then by logic, then there's certain responsibilities that would be involved. And that's kind of where we get to kind of seeing this expressed in today's world. Certainly, at least here within the United States, this naturalism, evolution is dominant. I mean, you have to admit it. In public schools, with our kids, on science programs, museums, even the government now to some degree, say, are promoting, natural evolution. Even some religious denominations within quote unquote Christianity, sad to say. On the other hand, there's a promotion of theism, Judeo-Christian ethics within some churches. Although even in that case, sometimes it's only offered as, well, it's a matter of faith. You just have to accept what the Bible says on blind faith. We're not really going to talk any about things from a scientific perspective. Other religious groups may say, yes, there is a creator, but he used evolution, quote unquote, theistic evolution, over millions of years, which is kind of a compromise between pure evolution and pure creationism. And then you may have some groups that will say, yes, God did create everything, but millions and billions of years ago. Some people call that old earth creationism. And others will say, well, no, the biblical record seems to indicate that he created everything and it wasn't that long ago. So even within religious groups, there's quite a bit of diversity. And of course, a lot of people say, well, this whole argument's kind of moot because after all, there's science and there's the Bible, and those are two different worlds. And science obviously is fact-based and the Bible is obviously faith-based. Well, that's not really fair either, because even within the world of science, you have to understand that generally scientific pursuits are looking for natural causes. There's the presumption or the assumption that, hey, I'm looking for the best natural reason, the best natural cause and effect, etc. And I don't want to rely on any sort of supernatural. Well, that's an assumption, if you will. Key point, Brian, I think is what's a Christian's perspective or responsibility, toward these things, toward evidence, toward investigating. Certainly the Bible speaks about truth and our need to investigate it. John 8:32, you shall know the truth shall make you free. 1 Thessalonians 5:21, test all things, hold fast what is good. 1 Peter 3:15, sanctify the Lord God in your hearts and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks your reason for the hope that is in you, in meekness and fear. In other words, it's not a blind faith. And that kind of puts Christians in kind of a weird spot because there's a lot of assertions that scientists make that Christian, if they're not prepared, may have trouble with. Scientists say the Earth is 4+ billion years old. How can you say it's created only thousands of years ago? Or scientists say that life came from non-living matter by some natural processes in an ancient primordial sea. How can you say it was created supernaturally? Or scientists may say the fossil record shows a lot of steady transition of simple forms buried deep in the earth to more complex forms closer to the surface. How can you believe all the plants and animals were created in a week? Or scientists may say, hey, we found all this fossil evidence that apes evolved into man. How can you say man was created? And so there's a lot of challenges that Christians, particularly in an evolution dominated culture, are faced with. Now, certainly the Bible acknowledges the role that we can learn about God from his creation. In fact, Psalms 19 starts off with, the heavens declare the glory of God and the firmament shows his handiwork. Brian, for our listeners, why don't you go over and read Acts 14, roughly 15 through 17.
Sure. Here it says, we preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God, who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all things that are in them, who in bygone generations allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness.
Right. And of course, later on, the Holy Spirit through Paul asserts something very similar. Romans chapter 1, beginning verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, or God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. So we see from Brian these passages that there are certainly evidences in the natural world, left behind by the Creator, that points to the Creator. The creation points to the Creator, so to speak. And I know some Christians, kind of shy away from the science side of this topic, creation and evolution, and they may prefer to, quote Scripture. But practically speaking, if you're dealing with, people in the world, or with your kids that are being raised in public schools and are being fed a diet of quote unquote science, and a pure appeal just to the scriptures may not have that much weight, particularly if people have been indoctrinated all their lives in this dominant dogma, if you will, of what quote unquote science has to say. So anyway, I say all that to say one of the things I did in my class was I really tried to emphasize the science side of the evidence. And yes, indeed, as we'll kind of get into in our podcast, there's a lot of science you may not hear about because it doesn't support evolution. It really supports creation. So, Brian, all of that is kind of like introductory, kind of laying some foundation. Do you have any thoughts before we start digging deeper?
Yeah, this question of how did we get here is really a question I think most would ask within their life, right? We're just curious. How did we get here? And, I feel like this is also an important subject because, at least here in the United States, evolution has permeated our school systems and really is not only presented, but just assumed to be fact, not just within our schools, but really in many parts of our society. And so, in my life, this is a conversation, evolution versus creation or evolution in general that I've had with many people when talking to them about religion. And often it's because they also are curious and they also see this potential conflict. It's actually not even potential, right? This real conflict between what the Bible says and what man says, what the philosophies of men are. And so as we get into this study, what our listeners will find out is it can get pretty deep. And our goal isn't to kind of lose you in all the details, but to give you kind of at a high level, as simply as we can, what some of the basic premises are for evolution, for creation, and then hopefully, spark some interest, right, Jeff, for our listeners to go out and dig a little bit deeper if they really want to get into it deeper.
Yeah, and that's a good point because I'm not a scientist. I'm really more of an engineer. And I'm not a biologist. I'm not a physicist. I don't study cellular biology as a career. And you're right, this can get real deep, real confusing real quickly. And so I think what we're going to try and do is give people some of the more simpler kind of perspectives, and definitely would encourage them to research it further. As you said, we do have some materials on our website, including my original notes in the class that I gave, that we can certainly encourage people to take advantage to really dig deeper into this very, very deep and potentially confusing topic. So where do we want to start with actual material?
Yeah, I think a good starting place is, kind of looking at the three main explanations that are offered by many for the origin of the universe, for the origin of, the earth and life and man. And so really, when you think about kind of the three main explanations that are given, the most common, of course, when it comes to evolution is just natural evolution. And so this would be at a simple level, transformation from one kind to another. And so, for instance, you have, stellar evolution is one belief where you have, this Big Bang, and some of these theories we're going to talk about in more detail, no doubt. And Big Bang's one of them, right? So, some believe that we came from nothing. There was this Big Bang, which expanded the universe, that resulted in there being stars. The sun, right, which is really the center of our solar system, some believe kind of coalesced out of dust. Then you had this, hot Earth and moon that, that existed once again, just by chance. So all of this, as it relates to Big Bang is, hey, this just happened by chance. And there were some good results that came out of that. I would ask our listeners to think about, does any organization come from chaos? But that's, another something we'll get into more later. And then you have, theories like, all of this mass cooled to form the global ocean. You have some that believe in a chemical evolution, which would be, life from a non-life in a primordial ocean. So you start talking about, amoebas and protozoas and so forth. And like I say, we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then you have like biological evolution. And, when you think about molecules via mutations or through natural selection, or something like Darwin called the survival of the fittest, this is what resulted in this biological evolution. So you think about marine life and land plants and land animals and birds and man. The argument, of course, from evolutionists is that all of this happened through things like mutations and natural selection. You have what you described earlier, Jeff, as young Earth creationism, which, really is the belief that, this is the literal teaching from the Bible account of creation, where we had not only the creation, but a global flood. The Bible certainly talks about the universe and living organisms were divinely created. And when we say relatively recently, within 6 to 10,000 years ago. Now that's really a short period of time if you compare it to the millions of years that evolutionists will often cite as how long the Earth's been around and how long things have been evolving. So no doubt 6 to 10,000 years is certainly a lot shorter period of time than the millions of years. The second, or I guess I'd say the third, is really theistic evolution, as you referenced, Jeff, old Earth creationism. So as you pointed out also earlier, this idea of theism means that you believe in a divine being that created everything. And so you have some that do want to combine God and evolution and say, well, but there's room for both. So, you have, for instance, this gap theory where some say, if you look at Genesis chapter 1 and you read verses 1 and 2, we believe that occurred, but we believe that there was a gap of millions of years between those two verses. And like I say, we'll get more into that as well. You have some that believe in progressive creation. So this is, the religious belief that God created new forms of life gradually over a period of hundreds of millions of years. So you might say that God kind of put things in motion and then he just let evolution kind of take its course. And then you have a theory, day-age theory, the belief that the 6 days referred to in Genesis, when God created the earth in 6 days, are not ordinary 24-hour days, but rather a much longer period of time, so thousands or millions of years. And so, we're going to talk about these philosophies of men in more detail later in the study, but just at a high level, Jeff, we kind of have those three, right? Natural evolution, creation and the global flood that we read in the Bible, or a combination of both through theistic evolution.
Right. And one reason why I think it's useful to highlight these three, because in essence, they're three very different models or very different proposals, if you will, that are offered to explain the evidence that's available. And of course, that's the key question. We can go out and we can gather evidence and look at the evidence and then say, okay, given the evidence that we have, all right, which model of these three seems to fit the evidence we have. And that's a normal kind of scientific process. So even though we're talking about a biblical subject, we can talk about it within a scientific way. You gather the evidence. I got multiple, not complementary, they're more contradictory, models. Okay, so which one seems to fit? And of course, we're kind of we'll be doing that as we kind of go through our study today. Brian, any other thoughts before we talk about the origin of life?
Nope, let's dive right in.
All right. So, and again, this is going to get pretty deep pretty quickly, but we'll try to help you through it. So, it starts off with a very simple question that gets complex almost immediately. What is life? Okay. Even quote unquote simple life, that you may hear that term. Well, and if you pause to think about that, I would need to have some kind of an organism, a cell, if you will, some kind of basic little building block, if you will, that kind of distinguishes it from its environment. What does that really mean? Well, I have a cell, I got a cell wall, I got stuff that's within that has some kind of thing going on, and then I got my outside environment. That particular cell wall or cell membrane, well, okay, so now I'm in an environment, I got to somehow stay viable. This membrane around me, some has to let some things in and keep other things out. Otherwise, the things that are on the outside will harm me. I have to somehow take in energy, or I have to take in something that I can quote unquote digest. I have to get rid of waste products. uh, Even in very, very simple life, I have to be able to reproduce, split myself apart and create two of me, so to speak, and the two become four, etc. You know, in some ways, I have to, sense my environment, etc. So even quote unquote simple life has to have a number of these kinds of things all working together. Otherwise, it doesn't live. It's just a bucket of goo, so to speak. Uh, Now, when we act, so that's what life would need. Okay. When we start looking at life down at the level of an individual cell, um, it is just totally mind-boggling, to be very blunt. I mean, the closest thing I can come to is almost like a computer program in the computer. Because I mean, when you actually dig within the cell, you start off with within the nucleus, you got this genetic material we call DNA. Fancy, or it's an acronym for a fancy term, deoxyribonucleic acid. But that's basically the core building blocks of life within the genetic material. Well, that genetic material is just like a computer program, right? It has all these different codes. Um, but in and of itself, it can't do anything. You need some mechanism to interpret that code and be able to manufacture, based on those codes, other things that I need in the cell, to function. And with my students, what I tried to do is compare that with like a modern city that has, like, blueprints in the city hall, blueprints for building, for buildings and roads and electrical power distribution networks and sewage systems and whatever. And I got all these blueprints in City Hall, and somehow there are people that interpret those blueprints and send out instructions out into the city for creating, bridges and roads, and again, power distribution and sewage control, etc., and many other essential functions, for the city to actually work, in this analogy, for a cell to live. But what really blows my mind in this analogy of a city, the city, as well as the cell, has to be able to reproduce, has to be able to split itself apart, has to be able to create duplicates of itself first, and then split itself apart. It's like a city, and while it's functioning and living and whatever, we're going to start creating, building two city halls and two highway networks and two sets of power distribution systems and two sets of sewage, all at the same time, while people are living and functioning and things and cars are going around. And then it's going to physically pull itself apart into two, and all the while still function. And when it's all done, you got two that are fully functional. That just blows my mind, to be very bluntly. And there's some further reference in our class material. Now here's the question: randomness can produce that? all this complex interaction from the blueprints in the DNA to people that are interpreting those blueprints, or micro machines within the cell that are reading the DNA and creating all the proteins and all the other things that the cell needs. All of it has to exist all at once for life to exist. That argument is sometimes called irreducible complexity. And I know that's a fancy term. But basically, it comes back to the origin of life. Can I randomly assemble little bits and pieces from my environment, or just have them kind of floating around, little bits of protein, whatever, that over eons of time, millions of years, that these things will somehow just randomly come into a certain combination that it'll start itself up? And that just makes no sense, to be very blunt. And so now we've got, there's your evidence. Okay, I got 3 different models. How does that evidence, which model seems to be supported by that evidence? And that's where you get into, in the origin of life, several different explanations. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, 1800s, where they had the theory of quote unquote spontaneous generation. Now, it's now been disproven, but at the time, it was a thought that, living organisms could emerge spontaneously from matter. What at the time was happening, which they didn't realize, for instance, larvae would emerge spontaneously out of rotting meat. And what they didn't realize at the time was flies had planted their eggs in the meat, and then the larvae emerged from the meat. But they hadn't yet developed that degree of sophistication to realize that. That living creatures could rise from non-living matter, and that such processes were commonplace and quite regular. And of course, that's been disproven, spontaneous generation. So that doesn't fit. There's something, a technical term called abiogenesis. And basically that says life arose from non-living matter. And that's the common view today, that out of some primordial goo in some ancient ocean, somehow these chemicals randomly sort of floating around and coming together produced this quote unquote simple life, which we've already shown is not simple by any stretch. And in fact, there have been some experiments to kind of try to show how that could be possible based on certain assumptions about the ancient oceans and passing electoral arcs through these sort of chemicals. But that doesn't work either, because again, you just get little random bits of proteins, and they're certainly not collaborating, working together to be self-replicating, for instance. So those sorts of experiments, you may have heard of the Miller experiment, and that's what those were about, back in the 1950s. That doesn't work either, because again, they're based on assumptions, and basically you wind up with little bits of stuff, but nothing that would resemble anything like a multi-million lines of computer program that's all working perfectly to produce the cell. And some scientists have looked at this evidence, and they say, yeah, that's hard to believe. And so there's another theory called panspermia, which basically says, well, okay, life on this planet really didn't originate here. It originated somewhere else. That life somehow, arose somewhere else in the galaxy, and somehow made its way to Earth. And that's why you often hear, a lot of buzz in the scientific community with NASA, et cetera, about, looking for life on other planets, or looking for life in meteorites, or evidence of life, et cetera. And so again, people are looking for evidence that life, kind of came, sailing across the cosmos. And of course, if it doesn't really resolve the problem, it just pushes it further away. Say, well, if life didn't originate on this planet, well, how did it originate on some other planet? Same problem, again, with primordial goo and all that kind of stuff. So that theory doesn't seem to fit real well, which leads us to yet another theory, sometimes called intelligent design. Now, that now begins to use this scientific evidence that we're seeing to make an argument for, guess what? The existence of some kind of designer. And a design points to a designer. All this complexity in the simple cell points to something that can't just happen by randomness, that there has to be some scientific explanation that brings all this stuff together all at the same time and makes it viable. And again, that's part of intelligent design, which is consistent with what the Bible has to say. Now, admittedly, if you go out on the internet and you look up quote unquote intelligent design, you will see some bias against it, because after all, that is now a creation kind of thing, a supernatural kind of thing. And people will realize, well, that contradicts quote unquote natural evolution. And so you may read some bias against it. But given all that complexity, which of the three models seems to fit best, given the complexity that we're seeing within the cell? Well, given that kind of overwhelming complexity, it is certainly very reasonable to believe in an intelligent design by an intelligent designer who has the smarts and the ability to bring together what basically to us would be a super complex computer software program and the hardware to actually execute it, and the ability for it to create copies of itself, and which not even our modern technology can even approach it within our computer programs and software and hardware. And now we're talking about down on the scale that's tiny, super tiny. Anyway, in this particular case, from non-life to life, given the complexity of life, the model that seems to fit the best is the creationist model. Brian, any comments?
Yeah, very good summary. And that's the key question, right? And as we go throughout this, we're just going to keep asking the question, when you look at the evidence, as you pointed out, right? What is most likely? What makes the most sense? And as we continue to get into this, Jeff, I think it just becomes clearer and clearer, right? Many more questions with evolution, many more theories debunked, if you will, by just evaluating the complexities of our bodies and the universe around us, right? So anyhow, good thoughts.
Well, and that's a good point, because at least on a superficial level, again, you may hear people say, well, life arose from non-life. It was simple life. Really? Simple life. Okay. Sometimes you have to, push beyond kind of the superficial arguments and dig a little bit deeper. And sometimes when you do dig deeper, you will find that the evidence doesn't really support evolution. In fact, it actually refutes evolution and points to creationism. But anyway, and we'll get more into that as we continue through the podcast.
Yeah, so let's shift gears now and talk about what we might call diversification of life. So, the complexity of various life forms and what might be responsible for their origin. So, you've touched on some of these, Jeff, for instance, like motion. The cells of our human body have many structures which move throughout them, and all of these structures have to work in harmony. You have multi-cell organisms. You have photosynthesis, and our listeners might remember from school, when learning about plants, right? So photosynthesis really is a process used by plants and other organisms to convert light energy into chemical energy, and through something called cellular respiration can later be released, to fuel the organism's metabolic activities. Things like circulation of our blood clotting if we get a cut, so that it can seal or stop the bleeding. Coagulation, right? Your blood coagulates, it forms a scab, those kinds of things. When you look at these and many other processes that you touched on, Jeff, we have to ask the question, could have all these just happened by chance, or could have all of these been developed through the evolutionary process? So as we dig into this, once again, I just have that question in the back of your mind, because that's what we're really trying to determine here. There's a fascinating example of a beetle called the bombardier beetle and its defense mechanism. So if you think about it at a high level, whenever you have animals, you have insects, or you have anything, as we know just from studying these animals in nature, they have to have some defense mechanism. In fact, even plants, plants have what's called lectins, so that if an insect eats the plant, the lectin makes the insect sick, so that the insect no longer wants to eat that, right? It's a defense mechanism from the plant, so that once again, it's not eaten by these bugs. Well, when you look at a beetle or any other insect, for instance, they're going to probably, or they will have to have some defense mechanism, or they become extinct pretty quickly. So if you take a beetle, little insect, birds eat these all the time, for instance. If it didn't have a defense mechanism, well, through evolution, they become extinct pretty quickly, right? Because they can't defend themselves. So when it comes to this bombardier beetle, what you see if you examine is that it has the ability to produce 3 separate chemicals that it stores, that it has a valve to release it through, and what's called a reaction chamber that allows them to aim this mechanism, if you will, so that it can spray in a certain direction. So what does that tell us? Well, when you think about this particular mechanism, it all has to work in harmony with one another. So in other words, when you think about evolution, if it just had the chemical, but it didn't have a way to release it, or if it had the chemical or the valve, but it could only release it in one direction, maybe it can only protect itself from something coming up from behind, but not in front of it, or a bird that swoops in to grab it. So when you look at that and you say, well, all of these had to be together. In other words, it couldn't have evolved over time. It would have had to all be there at one time. Otherwise, this beetle could not protect itself. So what does that prove? Well, it proves that it had to be what we call fully formed, and it could not have developed these characteristics over years. Now, once scientists realize that, we have to acknowledge that, and it conflicts with this idea of evolution over, a long period of time for this beetle to have all of those qualities, they started coming up with alternate theories, like something called punctuated equilibrium, where they would then argue, well, the evolution happened pretty quickly. So we agree all of these things would need to be there for the beetle to protect itself. So it happened very quickly. But if you think about that logic, even then, the bug would not have survived to evolve, because it wouldn't have survived at all without any defense mechanism. So if you tell me, well, he didn't, or the beetle didn't evolve over millions of years, it was just thousands of years or hundreds of years or even 10 years, that beetle wouldn't survive 10 years with no defense mechanism. So it's just a fallacious argument if you think about it. There are many examples of this where species, once again, would not have survived if they were not fully formed and they didn't have these defense mechanisms. And, there's an interesting quote, Jeff, from Charles Darwin, if you look in his writing on the origin of the species, where he says, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. So I think that's a good quote, because he's exactly right. It falls apart if you can prove that these things couldn't possibly have been formed in the way they were over millions of years. So anyhow, before we continue on, Jeff, any thoughts about that and how that helps us to understand the problems with evolution? Well,
and in the particular case of the bombardier beetle you mentioned, I have a reference here on the internet I was pulling up while you were talking. So there's at least, this little critter produces at least 2 chemicals, one of which is hydrogen peroxide. They're mixed together, and the resulting spray is at the boiling point of water. Interesting, 212 roughly degrees Fahrenheit. That's hot.
It's a predator.
And part of the chemical, I think, is hydroquinone, which may also have some, acidic or poisonous properties. But the fact that it can produce these things, produce the chemicals, store them safely in its body, release them when needed, mix together at the right mixture, it doesn't blow itself up or corrode back into its internal organs, is just mind-boggling. If our readers, study things like photosynthesis, or study, how our blood clots. Blood clotting is a good example. If you look at all of the chemical reactions that have to occur, it's not just the blood clots. Well, no. It's very much more complex than that. So all kinds of cascading chemical reactions and enzymes and proteins and everything is all that's required to produce the clot where you need it, when you need it, and not just randomly in the body. Those kind of clots kill people, right? And that once things are sort of stabilizing back to normal, takes that clot and then reabsorbs it. Extremely complex, just extremely complex. And many of these other examples we could cite that people can go out in the internet. So that's kind of the evidence that's in front of us. These very, very complex, multiple interactions of all different kinds of chemicals, like within our bodies or within insects or other animals. What model best fits it. So yeah, that's I'll turn it back over to you, Brian. It's just the more you dig into it, the more fascinating it is.
Yeah, and then we go back to that question: is it reasonable to say that this could have either happened by chance or over millions of years through evolution? And I was mentioning that when you start debunking some of these philosophies of men, as we see in many subjects, not just evolution, that they change the argument, right? And so we'll look at a couple more where in addition to proposing this rapid evolution as a potential answer, there's some other explanations, right? So some would point to what's called Lamarckism or Lamarckian inheritance. And so this is where, there's a belief that an organism can pass on to its offspring physical characteristics that the parent organism acquired through use or disuse during its lifetime. For example, muscles or tan skin or, a giraffe's neck, stretched neck. Why is this something that doesn't fit, if you will? Well, when you look at inheritance, it's really through genetics, not acquired characteristics. And we'll get a little bit more into that in a minute, but you also have this thought of natural selection or survival of the fittest, which is what our listeners probably recognize from Darwin, Charles Darwin, right? These were his philosophies. And so what does it mean, natural selection, survival of the fittest? Well, natural selection is the process whereby organisms better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. And so, you think about survival of the strongest, if you will. It might be another way that you look at it. And in fact, this is kind of believed to be the main process that brings about evolution. And so, Jeff, there are some examples of, this existing genetic diversity. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about dogs and antibiotic resistance and so forth. That would kind of help to illustrate some challenges with this.
Right. Well, and I think what we can actually observe, in our natural environment are creatures that, over time, to some degree change or at least appear to change. I mean, for instance, even over our lifetime and looking back into, some of the historical records, like things with dogs, by changing their environment and, selective breeding, et cetera, we can easily see there's a lot of genetic diversity within, for instance, dogs that over time, via their environment and selection process, of course, in this case, it's humans doing the selection, but through a selection process, that favors, dogs with certain coloration, hair texture, height, width, different abilities, we have been able to, or the genetic material has been able to accommodate, so to speak, large dogs, Great Danes and Grand Pyrenees, and tiny dogs like Chihuahuas, and dogs that are, short and squatty but elongated, like small hounds and what we would call wiener dogs, and dogs that are able to be extremely furry or have very little fur, or et cetera, or very fast, et cetera, like greyhounds. And so a lot of genetic diversity or genetic variability within the dogs, and of course with the environment around them changing. Some dogs survive better in different environments. We see that, right? Certainly we see it in the modern era with bacteria, with viruses, where for instance with given bacteria and the introduction of antibiotics, we triumphed over, some kinds of bacteria. Well, sort of. But there's enough variation within bacteria, for instance, that, not every single one of them was killed off, when we introduced penicillin, for instance, that some perhaps had some genetic variation that allowed a few of them perhaps to survive. And because of that, that was passed on to their, that variation or that ability was passed on to their offspring. And now we have penicillin resistant, strains of bacteria today. I think one of the more interesting cases of natural selection occurring was observed actually in New England, or not New England, sorry, in England, during the Industrial Revolution, with a certain kind of moth that before the Industrial Revolution, there was a color variation. I mean, there were lighter colored moths and darker colored moths. And given the fact that the trees in the area tended to be lighter colored, well, the lighter colored moths were favored. They tended to survive, and the darker colored moths tended to be eaten. A few managed to survive, but ratio-wise, mostly light, a few dark. Then along comes the Industrial Revolution, use of coal, burning of coal, putting soot in the environment. That soot settles on the trees. The bark starts to turn dark, and now the lighter colored moths are more visible, and more of them start getting eaten. And the darker colored moths are now better camouflaged, and fewer of them get eaten. And of course, they pass that along, and so the population shifts. Post-industrial evolution, coal gets replaced by natural gas, etc., and the skies, start clearing up, and the trees start reverting back to their normal lighter colored pigmentation, so to speak, because the soot's not on them anymore. And now the darker moths are more easily seen and start getting picked off more by the birds, and the lighter colored moths, start fitting in better camouflaged. And so you see the ratio of the population kind of shift yet again. But the key point in the example with the dogs, or the key point to some degree an example with the bacteria, and especially with the moths, is you had this genetic material already pre-existing. You can see that with the moths. I had light colored moths and dark colored moths before and during and after revolution. So natural selection, admittedly, certainly is a process that's out there that does favor, in some cases, some characteristics over others, if you happen to have the characteristic. But in and of itself, it doesn't explain how you got the characteristic to begin with. It doesn't explain the origin of the new genetic material. It certainly explains when material gets shuffled around, that different variations may be evident, but it doesn't really speak to how that original genetic material gets its origin. So yeah, lots of interesting examples. And again, Brian, this is an area where, in some cases, based on the evidence, yes, we can see this happening. And we may get into this a little bit later. Certainly, we see this degree of change or shifting populations. But in and of itself, this natural selection or survival of the fittest can't account for the origin of new genetic material.
Yeah, and so it sounds like you're saying the environment influenced which moths survived and which were eaten, and it really had nothing to do with survival of the fittest, right?
Well, at least for them in their environment, some were fitter than others, but it doesn't tell you, it doesn't account for the origin of the genetic material that would produce the difference in coloration. And so, it is there. It is a mechanism that sometimes does favor the fitter, but something's missing. And I think the something that's missing, I think you're going to introduce our listeners to next.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Just one other thought for me on this. I think it's a good example of there's some partial truths in this, right? In
True.
the sense
Absolutely.
that you think about a herd of elephants, for instance. The weak, the young, the
Sickly.
vulnerable, if you will, are going to be taken out.
Right.
And so, logically, that means the stronger survive, right? They're more likely to be able to not be killed. So,
True.
the environment does help some of that, but not in the strict sense that, of course, Darwin would suggest. So.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, another one is genetic mutations. And this is, of all the discussions I've had over the years, this is one argument that evolutionists love to bring up. Well, all of these changes are, and the needed defense mechanisms and things that we've talked about came about because of genetic mutation. So that's how they'll explain it. Well, let's look at what is a genetic mutation and what causes it. So if you look at kind of a simple definition of a genetic mutation, it's really a random and permanent alteration in our DNA sequence that makes up the gene. So when you think about mutations, they come in many forms, if you will, in many sizes. So for instance, they can affect anywhere from a single DNA building block to a large segment of a chromosome that includes multiple genes. And, mutations are caused by external factors. So for instance, when you think about being exposed to radiation, or you breathe some chemical, or it could even be internal factors, such as, there was a problem in copying the DNA during reproduction. These are things that can happen that result in genetic mutations. And so some examples that we see in our lives are, for instance, sickle cell anemia, people who are colorblind or that have Down syndrome, autism. These are all examples of what can occur when you have a genetic mutation. Now, one thing that is good is that it's pretty rare. It is usually harmful. So not in every case, but I would say more often than not, Jeff, I would say more often than not, it results in something harmful. So when you think about somebody who has Down syndrome, or what we might call mentally retarded, or autism, well, I think we can all see that's a very negative effect of a genetic mutation. And so, but what it can account for is, these complex interdependent characteristics that we've been talking about. These simple random changes cannot generate something complex like our eyes and our brains. And so, I think that's an important point here, because when you look at these mutations, number one, it often results in something like retardation and so forth. And, even these simple random changes cannot result in something complex. And when we talk about our eyes and our brains, if you've ever studied the human eye, it's one of the most complex parts of our body that to this day have many attributes that scientists just can't explain. Or how about our brains? If you look at the number of computations that the human brain can do within 1 second, it still far surpasses the strongest and fastest supercomputer in this world. And there are still many, once again, facets of the brain that just can't be understood. And so to think that you could have something like a genetic mutation result in being able to have something as complex as an eye or a brain, it just doesn't make sense. And so, the study that we talked about that you can reference, there's more material in there for more in-depth information. I encourage you to study that, because once again, it's people just throw out genetic mutations, and the evidence doesn't bear out that, once again, this could result in something complex.
Well, and one of the things that I tried to emphasize to my teenage students, in a way that they could perhaps relate to. I mean, some of them were, just beginning to get into computer programming. And I said, well, take this very complex computer program, millions of lines of code, similar to, like a Microsoft operating system, for instance. And I'm just going to go in and just start hacking. I'm just going to randomly change, one instruction to a different instruction, or I'm just going to randomly change, one bit of, a piece of data to an actual instruction, or a piece of instruction to a piece of data, or just whatever. Just go in and just randomly tweaking stuff. And we all recognize that basically a few tweaks and this thing is going to start to suffer, and a few more tweaks is just going to collapse. The other example that I gave to my students was like, if you're driving down the road in a car and you just start randomly tweaking things to the tires or the engine or the transmission or the electrical system or the battery or the whatever, or the gasoline mixture, just randomly start tweaking things. And what's going to happen? I mean, am I going to just kind of randomly tweak that car into a plane? Well, no. Am I going to randomly tweak that car into a piece of junk dead beside the road? Well,
Right.
yeah, right. So, I mean, you start talking about, dealing with any sort of complexity and random changes, which do happen, with natural selection, which does happen. basically results in the mechanism either dying off or being impaired, and not the introduction of new, better, even more complex, evolutionary advantageous characteristics that can be then, passed on to the descendants. So yeah, it just doesn't seem to fit the natural model, does it?
Yeah, well stated. And I tell you, it does come down to complexity, doesn't it? If we were just simple organisms with very, few complexities, okay, you might be able to make an argument, but I think you really nailed it when you talk about complexity into complexity. And, one of the other kind of hallmark arguments of evolutionists is this, change of one life form, such as a plant or an animal or an amoeba, into something else. And, that's just another example of they kind of have to go down this path if you want to have one species turn into something else. And so when you
Right.
think about, but what is a species? Well, a species is kind of at a simple level, a group of living organisms consisting of similar individuals capable of exchanging genes or interbreeding. And so we have a species. And in the Bible, the term kind is used to describe this. And so we see that starting in Genesis chapter 1. And so in the Bible, it's really kind of a broad term, describe a class of life forms such as birds or, animals or so forth. And then within this kind or class of animals, there is genetic diversity within that class, but not a transformation or evolution into another kind, that cannot be proven within the fossil record. So what am I saying? Well, if you had this genetic diversity that was outside of that class, right, or that kind, then surely within the fossil record, we would see fossils of organisms that were going through this transformation or evolution. So it was this kind of species in some early fossils. We get several thousand years down the road, we see that it is evolved now where it has an arm, where it didn't have an arm in that earlier fossil. And now we get farther down the world and we see it has a leg, right? And so we just see nothing like this in the fossil record. So when you ask somebody about that and you say, well, hang on, why don't we see this transitory fossil material, if you will? Well, their argument is, well, it takes millions of years. You wouldn't see it over the course of a couple hundred years. It has to be millions of years. And I think, Jeff, that's just a convenient way, right, to kind of explain away why we don't see these fossils.
Right. And I think we've got some more material on that as well further on. Where I kind of like to go with my students was, you mentioned biblical kinds, and certainly that was in the original creation, Genesis 1. Coming off of the ark after the great flood, you certainly have, or going onto the ark and then coming after the ark, two of every kind, again, a general kind of class, two of a cat kind, or two of a dog kind. And then what we see over time, for instance, with a dog kind, if you will, some genetic diversity, genetic diversification, if you will, into perhaps, wolves, or what we recognize as domesticated dogs, or dingoes, or perhaps foxes, etc. Dog-like creatures. So, do we see change or variation within a kind? Yeah, I mean I think that's pretty evident. What we don't see, as you're alluding to, is a change of one kind to another kind, like from a dog to a cat, for instance, or we start off with cats and then we wind up with dogs, etc. Because again, we're talking about a large number of highly complex kind of things for a given kind to survive, and you start pushing it, beyond that kind of a core set of capabilities, and things just don't work as well. In fact, Brian, if you talk to like dog breeders, my understanding is, with some kind of dogs, as they get more and more purebred, or as they get more and more pushed to the extreme, extremely large or extremely heavy or extremely fast or extremely short, or with extremely short noses, or whatever the case may be, that the breed is less and less viable. They have more and more problems. Like you may hear, some dogs that have problems, bigger dogs, problems with their hips. right? Or some dogs like pugs that have their noses, are so small that now they're having problems breathing, right? So it's almost like this biblical kind, has a lot of variation, but as you get more and more to the outer edges, the organism seems to suffer more and more problems, which would tend to indicate as you get closer to the edge, the more extreme cases start to die off because they're less viable, which would tend to keep the kind as a kind, if you will, and not enable a kind to keep changing limitlessly into other kinds. So makes for interesting observation, even within our own experiences.
Yeah, I completely agree. Good information. All right. Well, so that kind of brings us to the end of part one of this study. And just want to encourage you to come back next week, because we're going to continue this and talk a little bit more about, for instance, evidence for other forms of evolution, such as, the suggestion of the Big Bang Theory. We'll take a look at theistic evolution, as we discussed, kind of mixing God and evolution. We'll then get into talking about, the geological record and dating methods, how ancient life is dated to determine how old it really is. And then we'll also get into things like the fossil record, dinosaurs and man. And ultimately we'll finish up with, what does the Bible teach, right? And along the way, as we go through this, we're going to look at more passages as well, to help really show what the Bible says about some of these things. So encourage you to come back and for part two, and we'll dig a little bit deeper into this subject.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Bible Questions podcast. We invite you to visit our website at biblequestions.org, where you can find over 1,000 scripture-filled articles on a wide variety of Bible topics, along with about 24 free Bible study lessons and other Bible study aids. Plus, you can submit a Bible question to us to get a personal response within a couple of days. Check it all out at biblequestions.org.